This is ChestertonRadio.com.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 7, Chapter 4, Part 1, Irish and Other Interviewers. It is often asked what should be the first thing that a man sees when he lands in a foreign country. But I think it should be the vision of his own country. At least when I came into New York Harbor, a sort of grey and green cloud came between me and the towers with multitudinous windows, white in the winter sunlight. And I saw an old brown house standing back among the beech trees at home. The house of only one among many friends and neighbours, but one somehow so sunken in the very heart of England as to be unconscious of her imperial or international position, and out of the sound of her perilous seas. But what made most clear the vision that revisited me was something else. Before we touched land, the men of my own guild, the journalists and reporters, had already boarded the ship like pirates, and one of them spoke to me in an accent that I knew, and thanked me for all I had done for Ireland. And it was at that moment that I knew most vividly what I wanted was to do something for England. Then, as it chanced, I looked across the Statue of Liberty, and saw that great bronze was gleaming green in the morning light. I had made all the obvious jokes about the Statue of Liberty. I found it had a soothing effect on earnest prohibitionists on the boat, to urge, as a point of dignity and delicacy, that it ought to be given back to the French, a vicious race abandoned to the culture of the vine. I proposed that the last liquors on board should be poured out in a pagan libation before it. And then I suddenly remembered that this Liberty ship was still in some sense enlightening the world, or one part of the world, was a lamp for one sort of wanderer, a star of one sort of seafarer. To one persecuted people at least this land had really been an asylum, even if recent legislation, as I have said, had made them think it a lunatic asylum. They had made it so much their home that the very colour of the country seemed to change with the infusion, as the bronze of the great statue took on a semblance of the wearing of the green. It is a commonplace that the Englishman has been stupid in his relations with the Irish, but he has been far more stupid in his relations with the Americans on the subject of the Irish. His propaganda has been worse than his practice, and his defence more ill-considered than the most indefensible things that it was intended to defend. There is in this matter a curious tangle of cross-purposes, which only parallel example can make it all clear. And I will note the point here because it is some testimony to its vivid importance that it was really the first I had to discuss on American soil with an American citizen. In a double sense, I touched Ireland before I came to America. I will take an imaginary instance from another controversy in order to show how the apology can be worse than the action. The best we can say for ourselves is worse than the worst that we can do. There was a time when English poets and other publicists could always be inspired with instantaneous indignation about the persecuted Jews in Russia. We have heard less about them since we heard more about the persecuting Jews in Russia. I fear there are a great many middle-class Englishmen already who wish that Trotsky had been persecuted a little more. But even in those days Englishmen divided their minds in a curious fashion, and unconsciously distinguished between the Jews whom they had never seen in Warsaw and the Jews whom they had often seen in Whitechapel. It seemed to be assumed that by a curious coincidence Russia possessed not only the very worst anti-Semites, but the very best Semites. A moneylender in London might be like a Judas Iscariot, but a moneylender in Moscow must be like Judas Maccabeus. Nevertheless, there remained in our common sense an unconscious but fundamental comprehension that the unity of Israel, a sense that some things could be said and some could not be said about the Jews as a whole, Suppose that even in those days, to say nothing of these, an English protest against Russian anti-Semitism had been answered by the Russian anti-Semites, and suppose the answer had been somewhat as follows: "It is all very well for foreigners to complain of our denying civic rights to our Jewish subjects, but we know the Jews better than they do. They are a barbarous people, entirely primitive, and very like the simple savages who cannot count beyond 5 on their fingers. It is quite impossible to make them understand ordinary numbers, to say nothing of simple economics. They do not realize the meaning or the value of money. No Jew anywhere in the world can get into his stupid head the notion of a bargain, or of exchanging one thing for another. Their hopeless incapacity for commerce or finance would retard the progress of our people, would prevent the spread of any sort of economic education, would keep the whole country on a level lower than that of the most prehistoric methods of barter. What Russia needs most is a mercantile middle class, and it is unjust to ask us to swamp its small beginnings in thousands of these rude tradesmen, who cannot do a sum of simple addition or understand the symbolic character of a 3-penny bit. We might as well be asked to give civic rights to cows and pigs as to this unhappy half-witted race, who can no more count than the beasts of the field. In every intellectual exercise they are hopelessly incompetent. No Jew can play chess, no Jew can learn languages, no Jew has ever appeared in the smallest part in any theatrical performance. No Jew can give or take any pleasure connected with any musical instrument. These people are our subjects, and we understand them. We accept full responsibility for treating such troglodytes on our own terms. It would not be entirely convincing. It would sound a little far-fetched and unreal. But it would sound exactly like our utterances about the Irish, as they sound to all Americans, and rather especially to anti-Irish Americans. That is exactly the impression we produce on the people of the United States when we say, as we do say in substance, something like this: "We mean no harm to the poor dear Irish, so dreamy, so irresponsible, so incapable of order or organization. If we were to withdraw from their country, they would only fight among themselves. They have no notion of how to rule themselves. There is something charming about their unpracticability, about their very incapacity for the coarse business of politics, but for their own sakes it is impossible to leave these emotional visionaries to ruin themselves in the attempt to rule themselves. They are like children, but they are our own children, and we understand them. We accept full responsibility for acting as their parents and guardians." Now the point is not only that this view of the Irish is false, but that it is the particular view that the Americans know to be false. While we are saying that the Irish could not organize, the Americans are complaining, often very bitterly, of the power of Irish organization. While we say that the Irishman could not rule himself, the Americans are saying, more or less humorously, that the Irishman rules them. A highly intelligent professor said to me in Boston, "We have solved the Irish problem here. We have an entirely independent Irish government." While we are complaining in an almost passionate manner of the impotence of mere cliques of idealists and dreamers, they are complaining, often in a very indignant manner, of the power of great gangs of bosses and bullies. There are a great many Americans who pity the Irish, very naturally and very rightly, for the historic martyrdom which their patriotism has endured. But there are a great many Americans who do not pity the Irish in the least. They would be much more likely to pity the English, only this particular way of talking tends rather to make them despise the English. Thus both the friends of Ireland and the foes of Ireland tend to be the foes of England. We make one set of enemies by our action and another by our apology. It is a thing that can from time to time be found in history, a misunderstanding that really has a moral. The English excuse would carry much more weight if it had more sincerity and more humility. There are a considerable number of people in the United States who could sympathize with us if we would say frankly that we fear the Irish. Those who despise our pity might possibly even respect our fear. The argument I have often used in other places comes back with prodigious and redoubled force after hearing anything of American opinion. The argument that the only reasonable or reputable excuse for the English is the excuse of a patriotic sense of peril, and that the Unionist, if he must be a Unionist, should use that and no other. When the Unionist has said that he dare not let loose against himself a captive he has so cruelly wronged, he has said all that he has to say, all that he has ever had to say, all that he will ever have to say. He is like a man who has sent a virile and rather vindictive rival unjustly to penal servitude, and who connives at the continuance of the sentence, not because he himself is particularly vindictive, but because he is afraid of what the convict will do when he comes out of prison. This is not exactly a moral strength, but it is a very human weakness, and that is the most that can be said for it. All other talk about Celtic frenzy or Catholic superstition is cant, invented to deceive himself or deceive the world. But the vital point to realize is that it is cant that cannot possibly deceive the American world. In the matter of the Irishman, the American is not to be deceived. It is not merely true to say that he knows better. It is equally true to say that he knows worse. He knows vices and evils in the Irishman that are entirely hidden in the hazy vision of the Englishman. He knows that our unreal slanders are inconsistent even with the real sins. To us, Ireland is a shadowy isle of sunset, like Atlantis, about which we can make up legends. To him it is a positive ward or parish in the heart of his huge cities, like Whitechapel, about which even we cannot make legends, but only lies. And as I have said, there are some lies we do not tell even about Whitechapel. We do not say it is inhabited by Jews too stupid to count or know the value of a coin. The first thing for any honest Englishman to send across the sea is this: that the English have not the shadow of a notion of what they are up against in America. They have never even heard of the batteries of almost brutal energy of which I had thus touched a live wire, even before I landed. People talk about the hypocrisy of England in dealing with a small nationality. What strikes me is the stupidity of England in supposing that she is dealing with a small nationality, when she is really dealing with a very large nationality. She is dealing with a nationality that often threatens, even numerically, to dominate all the other nationalities of the United States. The Irish are not decaying. They are not unpractical. They are scarcely even scattered. They are not even poor. They are the most powerful and practical world combination with whom we can decide to be friends or foes. And that is why I thought first of that still and solid brown house in Buckinghamshire, standing back in the shadows of the trees. Among my impressions of America, I have deliberately put first the figure of the Irish-American interviewer, standing on the shore, more symbolic than the Statue of Liberty. The Irish interviewer's importance for the English lay in the fact of his being an Irishman. But there was also considerable interest in the circumstance of his being an interviewer. And as certain wild birds sometimes wing their way far out to sea and are the first signal of the shore, so the first Americans the traveller meets are often American interviewers, and they are generally birds of a feather, and they certainly flock together. In this respect there is a slight difference in the etiquette of the craft in the two countries, which I was delighted to discuss with my fellow craftsmen. If I could at that moment have flown back to Fleet Street, I am happy to reflect that nobody in the world would in the least wish to interview me. I should attract no more attention than the stone griffin opposite the law courts, both monsters being grotesque but also familiar. But supposing, for the sake of argument, that anybody did want to interview me, it is fairly certain that the fact of one paper publishing such an interview would rather prevent the other papers from doing so. The repetition of the same views of the same individual in two places would be considered rather bad journalism. It would have an air of stolen thunder, not to say stage thunder. But in America the fact of my landing and lecturing was evidently regarded in the same light as a murder or a great fire or any other terrible but incurable catastrophe. a matter of interest to all pressmen concerned with practical events. One of the first questions I was asked was how I should be disposed to explain the wave of crime in New York. Naturally, I replied that it might possibly be due to the number of English lecturers who had recently landed. In the mood of the moment it seemed possible that if they had all been interviewed, regrettable incidents might possibly have taken place. But this was only the mood of the moment, and even as a mood it did not last more than a moment. And since it has reference to a rather common and rather unjust conception of American journalism, I think it well to take it first as a fallacy to be refuted, though the refutation may require a rather longer approach. The end of Section 7, Chapter 4, Part 1.
You are listening to Chesterton Radio at chestertonradio.com.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 8, Chapter 4, Part 2, Irish and Other Interviewers. I have generally found that the traveller fails to understand a foreign country through treating it as a tendency and not as a balance. But if a thing were always tending in one direction, it would soon tend to destruction. Everything that merely progresses finally perishes. Every nation, like every family, exists upon a compromise, and commonly a rather eccentric compromise, using the word eccentric in the sense of something that is somehow at once crazy and healthy. Now the foreigner commonly sees some feature that he thinks fantastic, without seeing the feature that balances it. The ordinary examples are obvious enough. An Englishman dining inside a hotel on the boulevards thinks the French eccentric in refusing to open a window, but he does not think the English eccentric in refusing to carry their chairs and tables out onto the pavement in Ludgate Circus. An Englishman will go poking about in little Swiss or Italian villages, in wild mountains or in remote islands, demanding tea, and never reflects that he is like a Chinaman who should enter all the wayside public houses in Kent and Sussex and demand opium. But the point is not merely that he demands what he cannot expect to enjoy, it is that he ignores even what he does enjoy. He does not realize the sublime and starry paradox of the phrase vin ordinaire, which to him should be a glorious jest like the phrase common gold or daily diamonds. These are the simple and self-evident cases. But there are many more subtle cases of the same thing, of the tendency to see that the nation fills up its own gaps with its own substitute, or corrects its own extravagance with its own precaution. The national antidote generally grows wild in the woods side by side with the national poison. If it did not, all the natives would be dead. For it is so, as I have said, that nations necessarily die of the undiluted poison called progress. It is so in this much abused and over-abused example of the American journalist. The American interviewers really have exceedingly good manners for the purposes of their trade, granted that it is necessary to pursue their trade, and even what is called their hustling method can truly be said to cut both ways, or hustle both ways. For if they hustle in, they also hustle out. It may not at first sight seem the very warmest compliment to a gentleman to congratulate him on the fact that he soon goes away, but it really is a tribute to his perfection in a very delicate social art. And I am quite serious when I say that in this respect the interviewers are artists. It might be more difficult for an Englishman to come to the point, particularly the sort of point which American journalists are supposed, with some exaggeration, to aim at. It might be more difficult for an Englishman to ask a total stranger on the spur of the moment for the exact inscription on his mother's grave. But I really think that if an Englishman once got so far as that, he would go very much farther, and certainly go on very much longer. The Englishman would approach the churchyard by a rather more wandering woodland path. But if once he had got to the grave, I think he would have much more disposition, so to speak, to sit down on it. Our own national temperament would find it decidedly more difficult to disconnect when connections had really been established. Possibly that is the reason why our national temperament does not establish them. I suspect that the real reason that an Englishman does not talk is that he cannot leave off talking. I suspect that my solitary countrymen, hiding in separate railway compartments, are not so much retiring as a race of Trappists as escaping from a race of talkers. However this may be, there is obviously something of practical advantage in the ease with which the American butterfly flits from flower to flower. He may, in a sense, force his acquaintance on us, but he does not force himself on us. Even when, to our prejudices, he seems to insist on knowing us, at least he does not insist on our knowing him. It may be to some sensibilities a bad thing that a total stranger should talk as if he were a friend, but it might possibly be worse if he insisted on being a friend before he would talk like one. To a great deal of the interviewing, indeed much the greater part of it, even this criticism does not apply. There is nothing which even an Englishman of extreme sensibility could regard as particularly private. The questions involved are generally entirely public, and treated with not a little public spirit. But my only reason for saying here what can be said even for the worst exceptions is to point out this general and neglected principle, that the very thing that we complain of in a foreigner generally carries with it its own foreign cure. American interviewing is generally very reasonable, and it is always very rapid. And even those to whom talking to an intelligent fellow creature is as horrible as having a tooth out may still admit that American interviewing has many of the qualities of American dentistry. Another effect that has given rise to this fallacy, this exaggeration of the vulgarity and curiosity of the press, is the distinction between the articles and the headlines, or rather the tendency to ignore that distinction. The few really untrue and unscrupulous things I have seen in American stories have always been in the headlines, and the headlines are written by somebody else, some solitary and savage cynic locked up in the office, hating all mankind and raging and revenging himself at random, while the neat, polite and rational pressman can safely be let loose to wander about the town. For instance, I talked to two decidedly thoughtful fellow journalists immediately on my arrival at a town in which there had been some labour troubles. I told them my general view of labour in the very largest and perhaps the vaguest historical outline, pointing out that the one great truth to be taught to the middle classes was that capitalism was itself a crisis, and a passing crisis, that it was not so much that it was breaking down as that it had never really stood up. Slaveries could last, and peasantries could last, but wage-earning communities could hardly even live, and were already dying. All this moral and even metaphysical generalization was most fairly and most faithfully reproduced by the interviewer, who had actually heard it casually and idly spoken. But on the top of this column of political philosophy was the extraordinary announcement in enormous letters, "Chesterton takes sides in trolley strike." This was inaccurate. When I spoke, I not only did not know that there was any trolley strike, but I did not know what a trolley strike was. I should have had an indistinct idea that a large number of citizens earned their living by carrying things about in wheelbarrows, and that they had desisted from the beneficent activities. Anyone who did not happen to be a journalist, or know a little about journalism, American and English, would have supposed that the same man who wrote the article had suddenly gone mad and written the title. But I know that we have here to deal with two different types of journalists, and the man who writes the headlines I will not dare to describe, for I have not seen him except in dreams. Another innocent complication is that the interviewer does sometimes translate things into his native language. It would not seem odd that a French interviewer should translate them into French, and it is certain that the American interviewer sometimes translates them into American. Those who imagine the two languages to be the same are more innocent than any interviewer. To take one out of the 20 examples, some of which I have mentioned elsewhere, suppose an interviewer had said that I had the reputation of being a nut. I should be flattered, but faintly surprised at such a tribute to my dress and dashing exterior. I should afterwards be sobered and enlightened by discovering that in America a nut does not mean a dandy, but a defective or imbecile person. And as I have here to translate their American phrase into English, it may be very defensible that they should translate my English phrases into American. Anyhow, they often do translate them into American. In answer to the usual question about prohibition, I had made the usual answer, obvious to the point of dullness to those who are in daily contact with it, that it is a law that the rich make, knowing they can always break it. From the printed interview it appears that I had said, "Prohibition, all matter of $sign." This is almost a vowed translation, like a French translation. Nobody can suppose that it would come natural to an Englishman to talk about a dollar, still less about a $sign, whatever that may be. It is exactly as if he had made me talk about the Skelt and Stevenson Toy Theatre as a cent plain and 2 cents coloured, or condemned the parsimonious policy as dime wise and dollar foolish. Another interviewer once asked me who was the greatest American writer. I have forgotten exactly what I said, but after mentioning several names, I said that the greatest natural genius and artistic force was probably Walt Whitman. The printed interview is more precise, and students of my literary and conversational style will be interested to know that I said, "See here, Walt Whitman was your one real red-blooded man." Here again I hardly think the translation can have been quite unconscious. Most of my intimates are indeed aware that I do not talk like that, but I fancy that the same fact would have dawned on the journalist to whom I had been talking. And even this trivial point carries with it the two truths which must be, I fear, the rather monotonous moral of these pages. The first is that America and England can be far better friends when sharply divided than when shapelessly amalgamated. These two journalists were false reporters, but they were true translators. They were not so much interviewers as interpreters. And the second is that in any such difference it is often wholesome to look beneath the surface for superiority. For ability to translate does imply ability to understand, and many of these journalists really did understand. I think there are many English journalists who would be more puzzled by so simple an idea as the plutocratic foundation of prohibition. But the American knew at once that I meant it was a matter of a $sign, probably because he knew very well that it is. Then again, there is a curious convention by which American interviewing makes itself out much worse than it is. The reports are far more rowdy and insolent than the conversations. This is probably a part of the fact that a certain vivacity, which to some seems vitality and to some vulgarity, is not only an ambition but an ideal. It must always be grasped that this vulgarity is an ideal even more than it is a reality. It is an ideal when it is not a reality. A very quiet and intelligent young man in a soft black hat and tortoise-shell spectacles will ask for an interview with unimpeachable politeness, wait for his living subject with unimpeachable patience, talk to him quite sensibly for 20 minutes, and go noiselessly away. Then in the newspaper next morning you will read how he beat the bedroom door in and pursued his victim to the roof, or dragged him from under the bed, and tore from him the replies to all sorts of bald and ruthless questions, printed in large black letters. I was often interviewed in the evening, and had no notion of how atrociously I had been insulted till I saw it in the paper next morning. I had no notion I had been on the rack of an inquisitor until I saw it in plain print, and then, of course, I believed it, with a faith and docility unknown in any previous epoch in history. An interesting essay might be written upon points upon which nations affect more vices than they possess, and it might deal more fully with the American pressman who is a harmless clubman in private and becomes a sort of highway robber in print. I have turned this chapter into something like a defence of interviewers, because I really think they are made to bear too much of the burden of the bad developments of modern journalism. But I am very far from meaning to suggest that those bad developments are not very bad. So far from wishing to minimize the evil, I would in a real sense rather magnify it. I would suggest that the evil itself is a much larger and more fundamental thing, and that to deal with it by abusing poor journalists doing their particular and perhaps peculiar duty is like dealing with a pestilence by rubbing at one of the spots. What is wrong with the modern world will not be righted by attributing the whole disease to each of its symptoms in turn, first to the tavern, then to the cinema, then to the reporter's room. The evil of journalism is not in the journalists. It is not in the poor men on the lower level of the profession, but in the rich men at the top of the profession, or rather in the rich men who are too much on top of the profession even to belong to it. The trouble with newspapers is the newspaper trust, as the trouble might be with a wheat trust, without involving a vilification of all the people who grow wheat. It is the American plutocracy and not the American press. What is the matter with the modern world is not modern headlines or modern films or modern machinery. What is the matter with the modern world is the modern world, and the cure will come from another. The end of Section 8, Chapter 4.
This is Chesterton Radio, your home for podcasts of works by G.K. Chesterton, plus drama, comedy, mystery, science fiction, big bands, and much more. The soundtrack to your Chesterton day at chestertonradio.com.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 9, Chapter 5, Part 1, Some American Cities. There is one point almost to be called a paradox to be noted about New York, and that is that in one sense it is really new. The term very seldom has any relevance to the reality. The New Forest is nearly as old as the Conquest, and the New Theology is nearly as old as the Creed. Things have been offered to me as the New Thought that might be more properly called the Old Thoughtlessness, and the thing we call the New Poor Law is already old enough to know better. But there is a sense in which New York is always new, in the sense that it is always being renewed. A stranger might well say that the chief industry of the citizens consists of destroying their city, but he soon realizes that they always started all over again with undiminished energy and hope. At first I had a fancy that they never quite finished putting up a big building without feeling that it was time to pull it down again, and that somebody began to dig up the first foundations while somebody else was putting on the last tiles. This fills the whole of this brilliant and bewildering place with a quite unique and unparalleled air of rapid ruin. Ruins spring up so suddenly like mushrooms, which with us are the growth of age, like mosses, that one half expects to see ivy climbing quickly up the broken walls, as in Nightmare of the Time Machine, or in some incredibly accelerated cinema. There is no sight in any country that raises my own spirits so much as a scaffolding. It is a tragedy that they always take the scaffolding away and leave us nothing but a mere building. If they would only take the building away and leave us a beautiful scaffolding, it would in most cases be a gain to the loveliness of the earth. If I could analyze what it is that lifts the heart about the lightness and clarity of such a white and wooden skeleton, I could explain what it is that really charming about New York. In spite of its suffering from the curse of cosmopolitanism and even the provincial superstition of progress, it is partly that all this destruction and reconstruction is an unexhausted artistic energy. But it is partly also that it is an artistic energy that does not take itself too seriously. It is first because man is here a carpenter, and secondly because he is a stage carpenter. Indeed, there is about the whole scene the spirit of scene shifting. It therefore touches whatever nerve in us has since childhood thrilled at all theatrical things. But the picture will be imperfect unless we realize something which gives it unity, and marks its chief difference from the climate and colours of Western Europe. We may say that the back scene remains the same. The sky remained, and in the depths of winter it seemed to be blue with summer, and so clear that I almost flattered myself that clouds were English products like primroses. An American would probably retort on my charge of scene shifting by saying that at least he only shifted the towers and domes of the earth, and that in England it is the heavens that are shifty. And indeed we have changes from day to day that would seem to him as distinct as different magic lantern slides, one view showing the Bay of Naples and the next the North Pole. I do not mean, of course, that there are no changes in American weather. But as a matter of proportion, it is true that the most unstable part of our scenery is the most stable part of theirs. Indeed, we might almost be pardoned the boast that Britain alone really possesses the noble thing called weather, most other countries having to be content with climate. It must be confessed, however, that they often are content with it. And the beauty of New York, which is considerable, is very largely due to the clarity that brings out the colours of varied buildings against the equal colour of the sky. Strangely enough, I found myself repeating about this vista of the West 2 vivid lines in which Mr. W.B. Yeats has called up a vision of the East. And coloured like the eastern birds at evening in their rainless skies. To invoke a somewhat less poetic parallel, even the untravelled Englishman has probably seen American posters and trade advertisements of a patchy and gaudy kind, in which a white house or a yellow motor car are cut out as in cardboard against a sky like blue marble. I used to think it was only new art, but I found that it is really New York. It is not for nothing that the very nature of local character has gained the nickname of local colour. Colour runs through all our experience, and we all know that our childhood found talismanic gems in the very paints in the paint box, or even in their very names. And just as the very name of Crimson Lake really suggested to me some sanguine and mysterious mere, dark yet red as blood, so the very name of burnt sienna became afterwards tangled up in my mind with the notion of something traditional and tragic, as if some such golden Italian city had really been darkened by many conflagrations in the wars of medieval democracy. Now, if one had the caprice of conceiving some city exactly contrary to one thus seared and seasoned by fire, its colour might be called up to a childish fancy by the mere name of raw umber, and such a city is New York. I used to be puzzled by the name of raw umber, being unable to imagine the effect of fried umber or stewed umber. But the colours of New York are exactly in that key, and might be adumbrated by phrases like raw pink or raw yellow. It is really in a sense like something uncooked, or something which the satiric would call half-baked. And yet the effect is not only beautiful, it is even delicate. I had no name for this nuance until I saw that somebody had written of the pastel-tinted towers of New York, and I knew that the name had been found. There are no paints dry enough to describe all that dry light, and it is not a box of colours but of crayons. If the Englishman returning to England is moved at the sight of a block of white chalk, the American sees rather a bundle of chalks. Nor can I imagine anything more moving. Fairy tales are told to children about a country where the trees are like sugar sticks and the lakes like treacle. But most children would feel almost as greedy for a fairyland where the trees were like brushes of green paint and the hills were of coloured chalks. But here what accentuates this arid freshness is the fragmentary look of the continual reconstruction and change. The strong daylight finds everywhere the broken edge of things, and the sort of hues we see in newly turned earth or the white sections of trees. And it is in this respect that the local colour can literally be taken as local character. For New York, considered in itself, is primarily a place of unrest. And those who sincerely love it, as many do, love it for the romance of its restlessness. A man almost looks at a building as he passes to wonder whether it will be there when he comes back from his walk. And the doubt is part of an indescribable notion, as of a white nightmare of daylight, which is increased by the very numbering of the streets, with its tangle of numerals, which at first makes an English head reel. The detail is merely a symbol, and when he is used to it he can see that it is, like the most humdrum human customs, both worse and better than his own. 271 West 52nd Street is the easiest of all addresses to find, but the hardest of all addresses to remember. He who is like myself, so constituted as necessarily to lose any piece of paper he has particular reason to preserve, will find himself wishing the place were called Pinecrest or Heather Crag, like any unobtrusive villa in Streatham. But his sense of some sort of incalculable calculations, as of the vision of a mad mathematician, is rooted in a more real impression. His first feeling that his head is turning round is due to something really dizzy in the movement of a life that turns dizzily like a wheel. If there be in that modern mind something paradoxical that can find peace in change, it is here that he has indeed built its habitation, or rather is still building and unbuilding it. One might fancy that it changes in everything, and that nothing endures but its invisible name. And even its name, as I have said, seems to make a boast of novelty. That is something like a sincere first impression of the atmosphere of New York. Those who think that is the atmosphere of America have never got any farther than New York. We might almost say that they have never entered America any more than if they had been detained like undesirable aliens at Ellis Island. And indeed there are a good many undesirable aliens detained in Manhattan Island too. But of that I will not speak, being myself an alien with no particular pretensions to be desirable. Anyhow, such is New York, but such is not the New World. The greatest American republic contains very considerable varieties, and of these varieties I necessarily saw far too little to allow me to generalize. But from the little I did see, I should venture on the generalization that the great part of America is singularly and even strikingly unlike New York. It goes without saying that New York is very unlike the vast agricultural plains and small agricultural towns of the Middle West, which I did see. It may be conjectured with some confidence that it is very unlike what is called the wild and sometimes the woolly West, which I did not see. But I am here comparing New York not with the newer states of the prairie or the mountains, but with the other older cities of the Atlantic coast. And New York, as it seems to me, is quite vitally different from the other historic cities of America. It is so different that it shows them all for the moment in a false light, as a long white searchlight will throw a light that is fantastic and theatrical upon ancient and quiet villages folded in the everlasting hills. Philadelphia and Boston and Baltimore are more like those quiet villages than they are like New York. If I were to call this book The Antiquities of America, I should give rise to misunderstanding and possibly to annoyance. And yet the double sense in such words is an undeserved misfortune for them. We talk of Plato or the Parthenon or the Greek passion for beauty as parts of the antique, but hardly of the antiquated. When we call them ancient, it is not because they have perished, but because they have survived. In the same way, I heard some New Yorkers refer to Philadelphia or Baltimore as dead towns. They mean by a dead town a town that has had the impudence not to die. Such people are astonished to find an ancient thing alive, just as they are now astonished, and will be increasingly astonished, to find Poland or the Papacy or the French nation still alive. And what I mean by Philadelphia and Baltimore being alive is precisely what these people mean by their being dead. It is continuity. It is the presence of the life first breathed into them and of the purpose of their being. It is the benediction of the founders of the colonies and the fathers of the Republic. This tradition is truly to be called life, for life alone can link the past and the future. It merely means that what was done yesterday makes some difference today, so what is done today will make some difference tomorrow. In New York it is difficult to feel that any day will make any difference. These moderns only die daily without power to rise from the dead. But I can truly claim that in coming into some of these more stable cities of the States, I felt something quite sincerely of that historic emotion which is satisfied in eternal cities of the Mediterranean. I felt in America what many Americans suppose can only be felt in Europe. I have seldom had that sentiment stirred more simply and directly than when I saw from afar off, above the vast grey labyrinth of Philadelphia, great Penn upon his pinnacle, like the graven figure of a god who has fashioned a new world, and remembered that his body lay buried in a field at the turning of a lane, a league from my own door. For this aspect of America is rather neglected in the talk about electricity and headlines. Needless to say, the modern vulgarity of avarice and advertisement sprawls all over Philadelphia or Boston. But so it does over Winchester or Canterbury. But most people know that there is something else to be found in Canterbury or Winchester. Many people know that it is rather more interesting, and some people know that Alfred can still walk in Winchester, and that St. Thomas at Canterbury was killed but did not die. It is at least as possible for a Philadelphian to feel the presence of Penn and Franklin as for an Englishman to see the ghosts of Alfred and of Becket. Tradition does not mean a dead town. It does not mean that the living are dead, but that the dead are alive. It means that it still matters what Penn did 200 years ago, or what Franklin did 100 years ago. I never could feel in New York that it mattered what anybody did an hour ago. And these things did and do matter. Quakerism is not my favourite creed, but on that day when William Penn stood unarmed upon that spot and made his treaty with the Red Indians, his creed of humanity did have a triumph, and a triumph that has not turned back. The praise given to him is not a priggish fiction of our conventional history, though such fictions have illogically curtailed it. The nonconformists have been rather unfair to Penn, even in picking their praises, and they generally forget that toleration cuts both ways, and that an open mind is open on all sides. Those who deify him for consenting to bargain with the savages cannot forgive him for consenting to bargain with the Stuarts. And the same is true of the other city, yet more closely connected with the tolerant experiment of the Stuarts. The state of Maryland was the first experiment in religious freedom in human history. Lord Baltimore and his Catholics were a long march ahead of William Penn and his Quakers on what is now called the path of progress. That the first religious toleration ever granted in the world was granted by Roman Catholics is one of those little informing details with which our Victorian histories did not exactly teem. But when I went into my hotel at Baltimore and found 2 priests waiting to see me, I was moved in a new fashion. For I felt that I touched the end of a living chain. Nor was the impression accidental. It will always remain with me, with a mixture of gratitude and grief. For they brought a message of welcome from a great American, whose name I had known from childhood, and whose career was drawing to its close. For it was but a few days after I left the city that I learned that Cardinal Gibbons was dead. The end of Section 9, Chapter 5, Part 1.
This is Chesterton Radio, the true, good, and beautiful at chestertonradio.com.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 10, Chapter 5, Part 2. Some American Cities. On the top of a hill on one side of the town stood the first monument raised after the Revolution to Washington. Beyond it was a new monument saluting in the name of Lafayette the American soldiers who fell fighting in France in the Great War. Between them were steps and stone seats, and I sat down on one of them and talked to two children who were clambering about on the bases of the monument. I felt a profound and radiant peace in the thought that they, at any rate, were not going to my lecture. It made me happy that in the talk neither they nor I had any names. I was full of that indescribable waking vision of the strangeness of life, and especially of the strangeness of locality, of how we find places and lose them, and see faces for a moment in a far-off land. And it is equally mysterious if we remember, and mysterious if we forget. I had even stirring in my head the suggestion of some verses that I shall never finish. If I go back to Baltimore, the city of Maryland. But the poem would have to contain far too much, for I was thinking of 1,000 things at once, and wondering what the children would be like 20 years after, and whether they would travel in white goods or be interested in oil. And I was not touched, it may be said, by the fact that a neighbouring shop had provided the only sample of the substance called tea ever found on the American continent. And in front of me soared up into the sky on wings of stone the column of all those high hopes of humanity 100 years ago. And beyond, there were lighted candles in the chapel and prayers in the antechambers, where perhaps already a prince of the church was dying. Only on a later page can I even attempt to comb out such a tangle of contrasts, which is indeed the tangle of America and this mortal life. But sitting there on that stone seat, under that quiet sky, I had some experience of the thronging thousands of living thoughts and things, noisy and numberless as birds, that give its everlasting vivacity and vitality to a dead town. Two other cities I visited which have this particular type of traditional character, the one being typical of the North and the other of the South. At least I may take as convenient antitypes the towns of Boston and St. Louis, and we might add Nashville as being a shade more truly Southern than St. Louis. To the extreme South, in the sense of what is called the Black Belt, I never went at all. Now English travellers expect the South to be somewhat traditional, but they are not prepared for the aspects of Boston in the North, which are even more so. If we wished only for an antic of antithesis, we might say that on one side the places are more prosaic than the names, and on the other the names are more prosaic than the places. St. Louis is a fine town, and we recognize a fine instinct of the imagination that set on the hill overlooking the river the statue of that holy horseman who has christened the city. But the city is not as beautiful as its name. It could not be. Indeed, these titles set up a standard to which the most splendid spires and turrets could not rise, and below which the commercial chimneys and sky signs conspicuously sink. We should think it odd if Belfast had borne the name of Joan of Arc. We should be slightly shocked if the town of Johannesburg happened to be called Jesus Christ. But few have noticed a blasphemy or even a somewhat challenging benediction to be found in the very name of San Francisco. But on the other hand, a place like Boston is much more beautiful than its name, and as I have suggested, an Englishman's general information, or lack of information, leaves him in some ignorance of the type of beauty that turns up in that type of place. He has heard so much about the purely commercial North as against the agricultural and aristocratic South, and the traditions of Boston and Philadelphia are rather too tenuous and delicate to be seen from across the Atlantic. But here also there are traditions, and a great deal of traditionalism. The circle of old families, which still meets with a certain exclusiveness in Philadelphia, is the sort of thing that we in England should expect to find rather in New Orleans. The academic aristocracy of Boston, which Oliver Wendell Holmes called the Brahmins, is still a reality, though it was always a minority, and is now a very small minority. An epigram invented by Yale at the expense of Harvard describes it as very small indeed. Here is to jolly old Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where Cabots speak only to Lowells, and Lowells speak only to God. But an aristocracy must be a minority, and it is arguable that the smaller it is, the better. I am bound to say, however, that the distinguished Dr. Cabot, the present representative of the family, broke through any taboo that may tie his affections to his creator and to Miss Amy Lowell, and broadened his sympathy so indiscriminately as to show kindness and hospitality to so lost a being as an English lecturer. But if the thing is hardly a limit, it is very living as a memory, and Boston on this side is very much a place of memories. It would be paying it a very poor compliment merely to say that parts of it reminded me of England. For indeed they reminded me of English things that have largely vanished from England. There are old brown houses in the corners of squares, and streets that are like glimpses of a man's forgotten childhood. And when I saw the long path with posts, where the autocrat may suppose to have walked with the schoolmistress, I felt I had come to the land where old tales come true. I pause in this place upon this particular aspect of America because it is very much missed in a mere contrast with England. I need not say that if I felt even about the slight figures of fiction, I felt it even more about solid figures of history. Such ghosts seemed particularly solid in the southern states, precisely because of the comparative quietude and leisure of the atmosphere of the South. It was never more vivid to me than when coming in at a quiet hour of the night into the comparatively quiet hotel at Nashville in Tennessee, and mounting to a dim and deserted upper floor where I found myself before a faded picture, and from the dark canvas looked forth the face of Andrew Jackson, watchful like a white eagle. At that moment, perhaps, I was in more than one sense alone. Most Englishmen know a good deal of American fiction and nothing whatever of American history. They know more about the autocrat of the breakfast table than about the autocrat of the army and the people, the one great democratic despot of modern times, the Napoleon of the New World. The only notion the English public ever got about American politics they got from a novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And to say the least of it, it was no exception to the prevalence of fiction over fact. Hundreds of us have heard of Tom Sawyer for one who has heard of Charles Sumner, and it is probable that most of us could pass a more detailed examination about Toddy and Budge than about Lincoln and Lee. But in the case of Andrew Jackson it may be that I felt a special sense of individual isolation. For I believe that there are even fewer among Englishmen than among Americans who realize that the energy of that great man was largely directed towards saving us from the chief evil which destroys the nations today. He sought to cut down, as with a sword of simplicity, the new and nameless enormity of finance. And he must have known, as by a lightning flash, that the people were behind him, because all the politicians were against him. The end of that struggle is not yet, but if the bank is stronger than the sword or the sceptre of popular sovereignty, the end will be the end of democracy. It will have to choose between accepting an acknowledged dictator and accepting dictation which it dare not acknowledge. The process will have begun by giving power to people and refusing to give them their titles, and it will have ended by giving the power to the people who refuse to give us their names. But I have a special reason for ending this chapter on the name of the great popular dictator who made war on the politicians and the financiers. This chapter does not profess to touch on 1 in 20 of the interesting cities of America, even in this particular aspect of their relation to the history of America, which is so much neglected in England. If that were so, there would be a great deal to say even about the newest of them. Chicago, for instance, is certainly something more than the mere pork-packing yard that English tradition suggests, and it has been building a boulevard not unworthy of its splendid position on its splendid lake. But all these cities are defiled and even diseased with industrialism. It is due to the Americans to remember that they have deliberately preserved one of their cities from such defilement and such disease, and that is the presidential city, which stands on the American mind for the same ideal as the president, the idea of the republic that rises above modern money-getting and endures. There has really been an effort to keep the White House white. No factories are allowed in that town. No more than the necessary shops are tolerated. It is a beautiful city, and really retains something of that classical serenity of the 18th century in which the fathers of the Republic moved. With all respect to the colonial place of that name, I do not suppose that Wellington is particularly like Wellington. But Washington really is like Washington. In this, as in so many things, there is no harm in our criticizing foreigners, if only we would also criticize ourselves. In other words, the world might need even less of its new charity if it had a little more of the old humility. When we complain of American individualism, we forget that we have fostered it by ourselves having far less of this impersonal ideal of the Republic or Commonwealth as a whole. When we complain, very justly for instance, of great pictures passing into the possession of American magnates, we ought to remember that we paved the way for it by allowing them all to accumulate in the possession of English magnates. It is bad that a public treasure should be in the possession of a private man in America. But we took the first step in lightly letting it disappear into the private collection of a man in England. I know all about the genuine national tradition which treated the aristocracy as constituting the state. But these very foreign purchases go to prove that we ought to have had a state independent of the aristocracy. It is true that rich Americans do sometimes covet the monuments of our culture in a fashion that rightly revolts us as vulgar and irrational. They are said sometimes to want to take whole buildings away with them, and too many of such buildings are private and for sale. There were wilder stories of a millionaire wishing to transplant Glastonbury Abbey and similar buildings as if they were portable shrubs in pots. It is obvious that it is nonsense as well as vandalism to separate Glastonbury Abbey from Glastonbury. I can understand a man venerating it as a ruin, and I can understand a man despising it as a rubbish heap. But it is senseless to insult a thing in order to idolize it. It is meaningless to desecrate the shrine in order to worship the stones. That sort of thing is the bad side of American appetite and ambition, and we are perfectly right to see it not only as a deliberate blasphemy, but as an unconscious buffoonery. But there is another side to the American tradition which is really too much lacking in our own tradition, and it is illustrated in this idea of preserving Washington as a sort of paradise of impersonal politics without personal commerce. Nobody could buy the White House or the Washington Monument. It may be hinted, as by an inhabitant of Glastonbury, that nobody wants to. But nobody could if he did want to. There is really a certain air of serenity and security about the place, lacking in every other American town. It is increased, of course, by the clear blue skies of that half-southern province from which smoke has been banished. The effect is not so much in the mere buildings, though they are classical and often beautiful. But whatever else they have built a great blue dome, the largest dome in the world. And the place does express something in the inconsistent idealism of this strange people. And here at least they have lifted it higher than all the skyscrapers and set it in a stainless sky. The end of section 10. The end of chapter 5.
This is ChestertonRadio.com.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 11, Chapter 6, Part 1. In the American Country. The sharpest pleasure of a traveller is in finding the things which he did not expect, but which he might have expected to expect. I mean the things that are at once so strange and so obvious that they must have been noticed, yet somehow they have not been noted. Thus I had heard 1,000 things about Jerusalem before I ever saw it. I had heard rhapsodies and disparagements of every description. Modern rationalistic critics with characteristic consistency had blamed it for its accumulated rubbish and its modern restoration, for its antiquated superstition and its up-to-date vulgarity. But somehow the one impression that had never pierced through their description was the simple and single impression of a city on a hill, with walls coming to the very edge of slopes that were almost as steep as walls, the turreted city which crowns a cone-shaped hill in so many medieval landscapes. One would suppose that this was at once the plainest and most picturesque of all the facts, yet somehow in my reading I had always lost it amid a mass of minor facts that were merely details. We know that a city that is set upon a hill cannot be hid, and yet it would seem that it is exactly the hill that is hid, though perhaps it is only hid from the wise and the understanding. I had a similar and simple impression when I discovered America. I cannot avoid the phrase, for it would really seem that each man discovers it for himself. Thus I had heard a great deal, before I saw them, about the tall and dominant buildings of New York. I agree that they have an instant effect on the imagination, which I think is increased by the situation in which they stand, and out of which they arose. They are all the more impressive because the building, while it is vertically so vast, is horizontally almost narrow. New York is an island, and has all the intensive romance of an island. It is a thing of almost infinite height upon very finite foundations. It is almost like a lofty lighthouse upon a lonely rock. But this story of the skyscrapers, which I had often heard, would by itself give us a curiously false impression of the freshest and most curious characteristic of American architecture. Told only in terms of these great towers of stone and brick in the big industrial cities, the story would tend too much to an impression of something cold and colossal like the monuments of Asia. It would suggest a modern Babylon altogether too Babylonian. It would imply that a man of the New World was a sort of new Pharaoh, who built not so much a pyramid as a pagoda of pyramids. It would suggest houses built by mammoths out of mountains, the cities reared by elephants in their own elephantine school of architecture. And New York does recall the most famous of all skyscrapers, the Tower of Babel. She recalls it none the less because there is no doubt about the confusion of tongues. But in truth the very reverse is true of most of the buildings in America. I had no sooner passed out into the suburbs of New York on the way to Boston than I began to see something else quite contrary and far more curious. I saw forests upon forests of small houses stretching away to the horizon, as literal forests do, villages and towns and cities, and they were in another sense literally like forests. They were all made of wood. It was almost as fantastic to an English eye as if they had all been made of cardboard. I had long outlived the silly old joke that referred to Americans as if they all lived in the backwoods. But in a sense, if they do not live in the woods, they are not yet out of the wood. I do not say this in any sense as a criticism. As it happens, I am particularly fond of wood. Of all the superstitions which our fathers took lightly enough to love, the most natural seems to me the notion it is lucky to touch wood. Some of them affected me the less as superstitions, because I feel them as symbols. If humanity had really thought Friday unlucky, it would have talked about Bad Friday instead of Good Friday. And while I feel the thrill of a 13 at a table, I am not so sure that it is the most miserable of all human fates to fill the places of the 12 apostles. But the idea that there was something cleansing or wholesome about the touching of wood seems to me to be one of those ideas which are truly popular because they are truly poetic. It is probable enough that the conception came originally from the healing of the wood of the cross, but that only clinches the divine coincidence. It is like that other divine coincidence that the victim was a carpenter, who might also have made his own cross. Whether we take the mystical or the mythical explanation, there is obviously a very deep connection between the human working in wood and such plain and pathetic mysticism. It gives something like a touch of the holy childishness to the tale, as if that terrible engine could be a toy. In the same fashion a child fancies that mysterious and sinister horse which was the downfall of Troy as something plain and staring and perhaps spotted, like his own rocking horse in the nursery. It might be said symbolically that Americans have a taste for rocking horses, as they certainly have a taste for rocking chairs. A flippant critic might suggest that they still select rocking chairs so that even when they are sitting down they need not be sitting still. Something of this restlessness in the race may really be involved in the matter. But I think the deeper significance of the rocking chair may still be found in the deeper symbolism of the rocking horse. I think there is, behind all this fresh and facile use of wood, a certain spirit that is childish in the good sense of the word, something that is innocent and easily pleased. It is not altogether untrue, still less is it unfriendly, to say that the landscape seems to be dotted with dolls' houses. It is the true tragedy of every fallen son of Adam that he has grown too big to live in a doll's house. These things seem somehow to escape the irony of time by not even challenging it. They are too temporary even to be merely temporal. These people are not building tombs. They are not, as in the fine image of Mrs. Meynell's poem, merely building ruins. It is not easy to imagine the ruins of a doll's house, and that is why a doll's house is an everlasting habitation. How far it promises a political permanence is a matter for further discussion. I am only describing the mood of discovery in which all these cottages built of lath, like the palaces of a pantomime, really seemed coloured like the clouds of morning, which are both fugitive and eternal. There is also in all this an atmosphere that comes in another sense from the nursery. We hear much of Americans being educated on English literature, but I think few Americans realize how much English children have been educated on American literature. It is true, and it is inevitable, that they can only be educated on rather old-fashioned American literature. Mr. Bernard Shaw, in one of his plays, noted truly the limitations of the young American millionaire, and especially the staleness of his English culture. But there is necessarily another side to it. If the American talked more of Macaulay than of Nietzsche, we should probably talk more of Emerson than of Ezra Pound. Whether this staleness is necessarily a disadvantage is, of course, a different question. But in any case, it is true that the old American books were often the books of our childhood, even in the literal sense of the books of our nursery. I know few men in England who have not left their boyhood to some extent lost and entangled in the forests of Huckleberry Finn. I know few women in England, from the most revolutionary suffragette to the most carefully preserved early Victorian, who will not confess to having passed a happy childhood with the Little Women of Miss Alcott. Helen's Babies was the first and by far the best book in the modern scriptures of baby worship. And about all this old-fashioned American literature there was an undefinable savour that satisfied and even fed our growing minds. Perhaps it was the smell of growing things. But I'm far from certain that it was not simply the smell of wood. Now that all the memory comes back to me, it seems to come back heavily in 100 forms, with the fragrance and the touch of timber. There was the perpetual reference to the wood pile, the perpetual background of the woods. There was something crude and clean about everything, something fresh and strange about those far-off houses to which I could not then have put a name. Indeed, many things become clear in this wilderness of wood, which could only be expressed in symbol and even in fantasy. I will not go so far as to say that it shortened the transition from log cabin to White House, as if the White House were itself made of white wood, as Oliver Wendell Holmes said, that cuts like cheese, but lasts like iron for things like these. But I will say that the experience illuminates some other lines by Holmes himself. Little I ask, my wants are few, I only ask a hut of stone. I should not have known in England that he was already asking for a good deal, even in asking for that. In the presence of this wooden world, the very combination of words seemed almost a contradiction, like a hut of marble or a hovel of gold. It was therefore with an almost infantile pleasure that I looked at all this promising expansion of fresh-cut timber, and thought of the housing shortage at home. I know not by what incongruous movement of the mind there swept across me at the same moment the thought of things ancestral and hoary with the light of ancient dawns. The last war brought back body armour. The next war may bring back bows and arrows. And I suddenly had a memory of old wooden houses in London, and a model of Shakespeare's town. It is possible, indeed, that such Elizabethan memories may receive a check or a chill when the traveller comes, as he sometimes does, to the outskirts of one of these strange hamlets of new frame houses, and is confronted with a placard inscribed in enormous letters, "Watch us grow." He can always imagine that he sees the timber swelling before his eyes like pumpkins in some super-tropical summer. But he may have formed the conviction that no such proclamation could be found outside Shakespeare's town. And indeed there is a serious criticism here to anyone who knows history, since the things that grow are not always the things that remain, and pumpkins of that expansiveness have a tendency to burst. I was always told that Americans were harsh, hustling, rather rude, and perhaps vulgar, but they were very practical, and the future belonged to them. I confess I felt a fine shade of a difference. I liked the Americans. I thought they were sympathetic, imaginative, and full of fine enthusiasms. The one thing I could not always feel clear about was their future. I believe they were happier in their frame houses than most people in most houses, having democracy, good education, and a hobby of work. The one doubt that did float across me was something like, will all this be here at all in 200 years? That was the first impression produced by the wooden houses that seemed like the wagons of gypsies. It is a serious impression, but there is an answer to it. It is an answer that opens on the traveller more and more as he goes westward and finds the little towns dotted about the vast central prairies. And the answer is agriculture. Wooden houses may or may not last, but farms will last, and farming will always last. The houses may look like gypsy caravans on a heath or a common, but they are not on a heath or a common. They are on the most productive and prosperous land, perhaps, in the modern world. The houses might fall down like shanties, but the fields would remain, and whoever tills those fields will count for a great deal in the affairs of humanity. They are already counting for a great deal, and possibly for too much, in the affairs of America. The real criticism of the Middle West is concerned with two facts, neither of which has been yet adequately appreciated by the educated class in England. The first is that the turn of the world has come, and the turn of the agricultural countries with it. That is the meaning of the resurrection of Ireland. That is the meaning of the practical surrender of the Bolshevist Jews to the Russian peasants. The other is that in most places these peasant societies carry on what may be called the Catholic tradition. The Middle West is perhaps the one considerable place where they still carry on the Puritan tradition. But the Puritan tradition was originally a tradition of the town, and the second truth about the Middle West turns largely on its moral relation to the town. As I shall suggest presently, there is much in common between this agricultural society of America and the great agricultural societies of Europe. It tends, as the agricultural society nearly always does, to some decent degree of democracy. The agricultural society tends to the agrarian law. But in Puritan America there is an additional problem which I can hardly explain without a periphrasis. There was a time when the progress of the cities seemed to mock the decay of the country. It is more and more true, I think, today, that it is rather the decay of the cities that seems to poison the progress and promise of the countryside. The cinema boasts of being a substitute for the tavern, but I think it is a very bad substitute. I think so quite apart from the question about fermented liquor. Nobody enjoys cinemas more than I, but to enjoy them a man has only to look and not even to listen. And in a tavern he has to talk. Occasionally, I admit, he has to fight, but he need never move at the movies. Thus, in the real village inn are the real village politics, while in the other are only the remote and unreal metropolitan politics, and those central city politics are not only cosmopolitan politics, but corrupt politics. They corrupt everything that they reach, and this is the real point about many perplexing questions. The end of section 11, chapter 6, part 1.
This is Chesterton Radio, your home for podcasts of works by G.K. Chesterton, plus drama, comedy, mystery, science fiction, big bands, and much more. The soundtrack to your Chesterton day at chestertonradio.com.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. What I Saw in America by G.K. Chesterton. Section 12, Chapter 6, Part 2, In the American Country. For instance, so far as I am concerned, it is the whole point about feminism and the factory. It is very largely the point about feminism and many other callings apparently more cultured than the factory, such as the law court and the political platform. When I see women so wildly anxious to tie themselves to all this machinery of the modern city, my first feeling is not indignation, but that dark and ominous sort of pity with which we should see a crowd rushing to embark on a leaking ship under a towering storm. When I see wives and mothers going in for business government, I not only regard it as a bad business, but as a bankrupt business. It seems to me very much as if the peasant women, just before the French Revolution, had insisted on being made duchesses, or, as is quite as logical and likely, on being made dukes. It is as if those ragged women, instead of crying out for bread, had cried out for powder and patches. By the time they were wearing them, they would be the only people wearing them. For powder and patches soon went out of fashion. But bread does not go out of fashion. In the same way, if women desert the family for the factory, they may find they have only done it for a deserted factory. It would have been very unwise of the lower orders to claim all the privileges of the higher orders in the last days of the French monarchy. It would have been very laborious to learn the science of heraldry or the tables of precedence when all such things were at once most complicated and most moribund. It would be tiresome to be taught all those tricks just when the whole bag of tricks was coming to an end. A French satirist might have written a fine apologue about Jacques Bonhomme coming up to Paris in his wooden shoes and demanding to be made gold stick in waiting in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But I fear the stick in waiting would be waiting still. One of the first topics on which I heard conversation turning in America was that of a very interesting book called Main Street, which involves many of these questions of the modern industrial and the eternal feminine. It is simply the story, or perhaps rather the study than the story, of a young married woman in one of the multitudinous little towns on the great central plains of America, and of a sort of struggle between her own more restless culture and the provincial prosperity of her neighbours. There are a number of true and telling suggestions in the book, but the one touch which I found tingling in the memory of many readers was the last sentence, in which the master of the house, with unshaken simplicity, merely asks for the whereabouts of some domestic implement. I think it was a screwdriver. It seems to me a harmless request, but from the way people talked about it, one might suppose he had asked for a screwdriver to screw down the wife in her coffin, and a great many advanced persons would tell us that the wooden house in which she lived really was like a wooden coffin. But this appears to me to be taking a somewhat funereal view of the life of humanity. For after all, on the face of it at any rate, this is merely the life of humanity, and even the life which all humanitarians have strived to give to humanity. Revolutionists have treated it not only as the normal, but even as the ideal. Revolutionary wars have been waged to establish this. Revolutionary heroes have fought, and revolutionary martyrs have died, only to build such a wooden house for such a worthy family. Men have taken the sword and perished by the sword in order that the poor gentleman might have liberty to look for his screwdriver. For there is here a fact about America that is almost entirely unknown in England. The English have not in the least realized the real strength of America. We in England hear a great deal, we hear far too much, about the economic energy of industrial America, about the money of Mr. Morgan or the machinery of Mr. Edison. We never realize that while we in England suffer from the same sort of successes in capitalism and clockwork, we have not got what the Americans have got, something at least to balance it in the way of a free agriculture, a vast field of free farms dotted with small freeholders. For the reason I shall mention in a moment, they are not perhaps in the fullest and finest sense a peasantry, but they are in the practical and political sense a pure peasantry, in that their comparative equality is a true counterweight to the toppling injustices of the towns. And even in places like that described as Main Street, that comparative equality can immediately be felt. The men may be provincials, but they are certainly citizens. They consult on a common basis, and I repeat that in this, after all, they do achieve what many prophets and righteous men have died to achieve. This plain village, fairly prosperous, fairly equal, untaxed by tyrants and untroubled by wars, is after all the place which reformers have regarded as their aim whenever reformers have used their wits sufficiently to have any aim. The march to Utopia, the march to the earthly paradise, the march to the New Jerusalem, has been very largely the march to Main Street, and the latest modern sensation is a book written to show how wretched it is to live there. All this is true, and I think the lady might be more contented in her coffin, which is more comfortably furnished than most of the coffins where her fellow creatures live. Nevertheless, there is an answer to this, or at least a modification of it. There is a case for the lady and a case against the gentleman and the screwdriver. And when we have noted what it really is, we have noted the real disadvantage in a situation like that of modern America, and especially the Middle West. And with that we come back to the truth with which I started this speculation, the truth that few have yet realized, but of which I, for one, am more and more convinced, that industrialism is spreading because it is decaying, that only the dust and ashes of its dissolution are choking up the growth of natural things everywhere, and turning the green world grey. In this relative agricultural equality, the Americans of the Middle West are far in advance of the English of the 20th century. It is not their fault if they are still some centuries behind the English of the 12th century. But the defect by which they fall short of being a true peasantry is that they do not produce their own spiritual food, in the same sense as their own material food. They do not, like some peasantries, create other kinds of culture beside the kind called agriculture. Their culture comes from the great cities, and that is where all the evil comes from. If a man had gone across England in the Middle Ages, or even across Europe in more recent times, he would have found a culture which showed its vitality by its variety. We know the adventures of the three brothers in the old fairy tales who passed across the endless plain from city to city and found one kingdom ruled by a wizard and another wasted by a dragon, one people living in castles of crystal and another sitting by fountains of wine. These are but legendary enlargements of the real adventures of the traveller passing from one patch of peasantry to another, and finding women wearing strange headdresses and men singing new songs. A traveller in America would be somewhat surprised if he found the people in the city of St. Louis all wearing crowns and crusading armour in honour of their patron saint. He might even feel some faint surprise if he found all the citizens of Philadelphia clad in a composite costume combining that of a Quaker with that of a Red Indian, in honour of the noble treaty of William Penn. Yet these are the sort of local and traditional things that would really be found giving variety to the valleys of medieval Europe. I myself felt a perfectly genuine and generous exhilaration of freedom and fresh enterprise in new places like Oklahoma. But you would hardly find in Oklahoma what was found in Oberammergau. What goes to Oklahoma is not the peasant play, but the cinema. And the objection to the cinema is not so much that it goes to Oklahoma as that it does not come from Oklahoma. In other words, these people have on the economic side a much closer approach than we have to economic freedom. It is not for us, who have allowed our land to be stolen by squires and then vulgarized by sham squires, to sneer at such colonists as mere crude and prosaic. They at least have really kept something of the simplicity and therefore the dignity of democracy. And that democracy may yet save their country, even from the calamities of wealth and science. But while these farmers do not need to become industrial in order to become industrious, they do tend to become industrial in so far as they become intellectual. Their culture, and to some great extent their creed, do come along the railroads from the great modern urban centres, and bring with them a blast of death and a reek of rotting things. It is that influence that alone prevents the Middle West from progressing towards the Middle Ages. For after all, linked up in 100 legends of the Middle Ages may be found a symbolic pattern of hammers and nails and saws, and there is no reason why they should not have also sanctified screwdrivers. There is no reason why the screwdriver that seemed such a trifle to the author should not have been borne in triumph down Main Street like a sword of state in some pageant of the Guild of St. Joseph of the Carpenters, or St. Dunstan of the Smiths. It was the Catholic poetry and piety that filled common life with something that is lacking in the worthwhile and virile democracy of the West. Nor are the Americans of intelligence so ignorant of this as some may suppose. There is an admirable society called the Medievalists in Chicago, whose name and address will strike many as suggesting a certain struggle of the soul against the environment. With the national hardiness, they blazon their note paper with heraldry and the hues of Gothic windows. With the national high spirits, they assume the fancy dress of friars. But anyone who should essay to laugh at them instead of with them would find out his mistake. For many of them do really know a great deal about medievalism, much more than I do, or most other men brought up on an island that is crowded with its cathedrals. Something of the same spirit may be seen in the beautiful new plans on the buildings of Yale, deliberately modelled not on classical harmony but on Gothic irregularity and surprise. The grace and energy of the medieval architecture, resurrected by a man like Mr. R.A. Cram of Boston, has behind it not merely artistic but historical and ethical enthusiasm, an enthusiasm for the Catholic creed which made medieval civilization. Even on the huge Puritan plains of the Middle West, the influence strays in the strangest fashion, and it is notable that among the pessimistic epitaphs of the Spoon River Anthology in that churchyard, compared with which most churchyards are cheery, among the suicides and secret drinkers and monomaniacs and hideous hypocrites of that happy village, almost the only record of respect and a recognition of wider hopes is dedicated to the Catholic priest. But Main Street is Main Street in the main. Main Street is Modern Street, and its multiplicity of mildly half-educated people and all these historic things are 1,000 miles from them. They have not heard the ancient noise, either of arts or arms, the building of the cathedral or the marching of the crusade. But at least they have not deliberately slandered the crusade and defaced the cathedral. And if they have not produced the peasant arts, they can still produce the peasant crafts. They can sow and plough and reap and live by these everlasting things. Nor shall the foundations of their state be moved. And the memory of those colossal fields, of those fruitful deserts, came back the more readily to my mind because I finished these reflections in the very heart of a modern industrial city, if it can be said to have a heart. It was in fact an English industrial city, but it struck me that it might very well be an American one. And it also struck me that we yield rather too easily to America the dusty palm of industrial enterprise, and feel far too little apprehension about greener and fresher vegetables. There is a story of an American who carefully studied all the sights of London or Rome or Paris, and came to the conclusion that it had nothing on Minneapolis. It seems to me that Minneapolis has nothing on Manchester. There were the same grey vistas of shops, full of rubber tires and metallic appliances. A man felt he might walk a day without seeing a blade of grass. The whole horizon was so infinite with efficiency. The factory chimneys might have been Pittsburgh. The sky signs might have been New York. One looked up in a sort of despair at the sky, not for a sky sign, but in a sense for a sign, for some sentence of significance and judgment. By the instinct that makes any man in such a scene seek for the only thing that has not been made by men. But even that was illogical, for it was night, and I could only expect to see the stars, which might have reminded me of Old Glory. But that was not the sign that oppressed me. All the ground was a wilderness of stone, and all the buildings a forest of brick. I was far in the interior of a labyrinth of lifeless things. Only looking up, between two black chimneys and a telegraph pole, I saw vast and far and faint, as the first men saw it, the silver pattern of the plough. The end of section 12. The end of chapter 6.
This is Chesterton Radio, the true, good, and beautiful at chestertonradio.com.